Hello, and welcome to Making Creativity Pay. I'm Dan Barnett, and in this podcast I talk to people in creative fields about the decisions they make around promoting, marketing and monetizing this work. This episode serves two purposes. It's an introduction to some of the people I've spoken to so far, and also an example of what can be done using chapters within podcasting. Chapters are something that are often overlooked within podcasting, but are a great way to add artwork or photos that may add to the experience, and also help signpost listeners to parts of the podcast that may be of particular interest. If you look at the show notes for this podcast, you'll see more information on what chapters can do. First guest up for the podcast was comedian Stuart Goldsmith, who discussed how monetizing his podcast developed.
So in my memory, and I'm happy to be corrected on this, I never even mentioned money for the first 3 years because it never occurred to me. And then someone gave me 20 quid, they pushed it into my hand, and then I mentioned it. And then people started pushing money into my hand at festivals. And then, I don't know which way round, I think it was that way round. So that gave me the idea to go, I should say, hey guys, do you want to donate to the show? You might not see me at a festival. Do you want to chuck a tenner to me via PayPal? And then I built a kind of PayPal button to do that. And the word built is a vast overestimation of my capabilities. It's very easy to do, and it took me ages. So then, because someone told me afterwards that what I had done was called, I think it's called permission marketing. I had given everyone a free thing for ages and then said, would you mind paying? And suddenly loads of people paid. That it didn't sustain at that thing because obviously people were like, sure, and then that was it. But that initial thing of, oh, holy shit, this isn't just a fun thing that gets my name out there. This is a potential income stream.
Next is Matt Curtis, who runs a beer and wine related site called Pellicle. Matt talked about the ethos of the site being free to view for everyone, with a pay if you can message, so nobody misses out, but gets across the point that without income there is no site. Gone for Patreon. Did you look at things like Buy Me a Coffee and other things like where it's just more of a, for want of a better phrase, a tip jar? I appreciate what you're doing. Here's some money. Did you look at those kind of things?
Patreon for us, as you said, my politics are quite left-leaning, and a lot of the way I run the business is founded in that, because I think everything, drinking a beer or making a magazine about beer, it's all a political act, right? So I believe that in the way we consume content now, and the whole point of the internet is for things to be open and accessible to all. That was the original idea of the internet. So I believe that I don't want to paywall content. I don't want to do exclusives. I don't want to give people who have the privilege of having more money to have exclusive content. I want people to be able to come and share in our joy of drinks. That's the whole point of Pellicle. So putting it behind the paywall would be counterintuitive to that. And so what we ask people is, if you think it's worth it and you can afford it, then support it. And if you support it, then you grow our resource and you make what we do better. And it, like I say, it all stems from this sort of political belief of that's how content now should be. I've been reading a lot at the moment, I'm sure a lot of people have, about NFTs. And if you ignore like pictures of monkeys and all that nonsense that the media doing, looking at it as a proper token that gives you access to content and parts of the web, I look at that and I'm thinking that is that would create a problem. That would create a barrier for my readers, because not all of our readers can afford to subscribe to a website or magazine. People who work in hospitality who don't get paid, who get paid minimum wage, and then you're asking them to read about their profession and ask them for more money. It doesn't sit well with me. And people do support us, so we know people can afford it. And as we grow our audience, hopefully that support goes. And it's all about, if we're going to write about a brewery doing amazing things, we don't want to say, you can only learn about this brewery if you can afford it. That doesn't sit well with me.
Next is Mark Steadman, founder at podcasting company Origin.fm. We discussed the value of putting the effort into your podcast for the future, not just the immediate listener. In terms of best practice within podcasts, example, this is hopefully, depending on when I get edited out, episode 3 of Making Creativity Pay.
Depends how hard a job I've made for you in the edit.
Yeah, so episode 2 is recorded and being edited. But as an example, it's probably about an hour's length. So, there's always a trade-off there. If I spend 6 hours editing that down to 35 minutes, but 3 people listen to it, there's no point in that. But again, if you don't spend the time and make it tighter, then it's a lot harder to kind of keep listeners. And there's always that balance of, should you from the start almost kind of build the best product, or don't bother? Or should you just be rough and ready and kind of not get too hung up on making it perfect?
That's a great question. I think Rough and Ready actually, like how you achieve that, or how you get to like a minimum viable decent sounding thing, has got a lot easier if you're prepared to. And again, it comes back to intention and like how much, what you're expecting and hoping to get out of what is either a hobby or what is a business, money making strategy for you. If you're prepared to spend $12, $15 a month, you can pay for an app like Descript, and you can make your editing life far, far easier, and turn what might be a 6-hour job into, for an hour podcast, maybe a 2-hour job, maybe a 2.5-hour job, because of the nature of the way it works. So you can achieve something that might not be perfect, but it's a lot better, and you can do that from day one without actually knowing a lot about audio. And I think that's great, because it allows more people to actually get their stuff out. I think it's not as simple as just making a great thing. Obviously, consistency is important, and it's that consistency of showing up that is really valuable, I think. And it's difficult because we often go into a new project not really with a sense of how long it's actually going to take to crank one of these episodes out, and then you get to the point where you realize you've spent 2 days on this. The point I would sort of pick up on is when you said like spending 6.5 hours editing an episode and only 3 people listen, so why bother? Okay, yeah, there's a few questions I could ask about that. But the one thing I would say is, and it's something I forget a lot, is, okay, this episode right now, this week, this 30-day period, maybe it got 3 listens. But what about in 6 months' time? What about what happens when your show becomes popular or builds up enough of a head of steam where people want to go through your back catalogue?
Next was Sophie Cross, founder and editor of Freelancer magazine. We talked about why she set up a print magazine in an increasingly digital world.
So I decided to target them at freelancers, and I was already quite a big part of freelance communities online and on social media. And it just went from there. I became like a bigger part of those communities because I was putting stuff out there. I made a couple of really short free courses. Everyone was really supportive, like extra supportive, because, everyone was really online at that point. I just started really listening to where I was part of these communities before, and you might go in and you might kind of just be having a bit of a laugh or asking for some help. I started really listening to like what problems are people having marketing themselves, because I knew that if I could help solve those problems, like my courses would be more popular. And it was sort of through that I realised there wasn't a magazine for freelancers, like being sort of a bigger part of those communities. I was like, oh, I don't know. It was actually New Year's Day 2021. I was like, oh, there's like, maybe I could make a magazine for freelancers. And that was that, really.
I've also spoken to a number of comedians about the economics of performing at the Edinburgh Fringe. Next is Norris talking about how to convey the ethos of an Edinburgh Fringe show and encourage people to attend from just a poster.
The whole show was modelled on that kind of David Copperfield aesthetic, like the very kind of sleek, black and red, like showbiz, Las Vegas kind of thing, because we basically wanted to use that as the centre of the show and then rip it apart as a metaphor for ego, basically. Like the whole show was about kind of paranoia and trying to control everything during lockdown and realising that you can't control, bits of your life are outside of your control. So trying to kind of anchor it on, we're going to use the ego of this magician character as a stand-in for all of that. So we made all the marketing materials look like that, like look like we were marketing a kind of David Copperfield type magic show, but with enough clues in there that it was a sort of a stupid version of that. As it turns out, we didn't necessarily do the best job of making it clear that it was a kind of absurdist nonsense comedy parody of those things, because it was about halfway through, one of the magicians from Morgan and West, who were a really great Fringe magic double act, came to see it and recommended it and said, all magicians have to go and see this show, but didn't clarify that the reason they should see it was because it affectionately mocks and kind of subverts their, what they do. And we ended up just getting a lot of magicians in every single day who I think thought that I was like the new interesting magic act on the Fringe. And we did get the audience reviews, if you go on the Ed Fringe site, are mostly really lovely. And then there's a couple that go, he didn't even do any proper magic tricks.
On the same episode as Joz, I spoke to Cerys Bradley, and they talked about why Edinburgh is different to other festivals and how performing the show daily improves it, but that having to do a full month is maybe not the optimal way of doing things.
This year I did the full run, but I did 2 preview shows at the beginning, and also I did the last day, which was technically one day after the last day, and I had one day off in the middle. And I think when I did maybe the 20th show, because I did like the full run, as many days as you possibly could do with one break in the middle. And I think when I got to about day 20, I was like, I now know the show is not developing from day to day. I now do not feel anymore the benefit of doing it every single day, because whilst on the one hand many people go up to the Fringe because you can say that you've done the Fringe and you've done the whole run and it's very heroic, on the other hand, like, just doing the show every single day does make it better. And I think there is an optimum point where you reach that point and you're like, having done the show X many days in a row, I have really perfected it in a way that I couldn't do if I'd only done like one every month for a year. And then when you get past that point, then you can start to overthink things or get fed up with the show or get bored with the show. And so I think everyone has an optimum, and it would be good if we could all work out what optimum is and go up for the optimum.
On a separate episode, I spoke to comedian Suchandrika Chakrabarti about the balance between online versus traditional marketing for getting people into shows and how it's becoming increasingly digital. And so next year, how much do you think the balance will be between online and offline in terms of promotion and marketing? I mean, maybe there will be no Twitter. Who knows by then?
Oh, such a good question. Yeah. All of us on Mastodon, which I really haven't figured out.
No.
I think flyering, I mean, it depends on the slot he gets, but maybe flyering is actually something I'd cut down. I think that, do we want to get people who are just walking by who've just got a slot there? Is that the right audience? Or do you want someone who's like engaging with your social media and has more context of who you are as a comedian and what the show is about? I don't know. I don't want to put down an audience who's just coming off the street and trying stuff. But I wonder if it's going to be a bit less of that again, because like, we're not going to be a wonderful financial state, I think, by August. I think we're still going to be in cost of living crises. I think people are going to be planning ahead, budgeting. And I think absolutely, I wonder if that stage is kind of, I wonder if flyering harks back to a time when people have more disposable income and fewer acts to choose between. And so there's this lovely kind of medium ground of like, do you know what? I can give all of these things a go. Whereas now I wonder if that marketing job almost has to happen earlier in people's experience of Edinburgh as an audience member. I don't have an answer. I don't know. I think the experimenting is really interesting. I think even with like doing previews, even with sort of doing my show from January onwards, you're building that online presence of like, oh, right, this is this new show I'm doing. This is the name. This is the artwork, which is so important, the image that describes your show. So I think there's something to say for like building that social. Yeah, I'd probably cut down on the flyering if I'm honest. They are really heavy and storing them could be difficult. Like there's not always space at the venue. If I keep them at home, then I'm taking the bus, blah, blah, blah. So really boring logistic stuff like that might mean that the flyers are cut down to the minimum, but then I'm giving TikTok more of a push. Or, I mean, maybe Bebo.com will come back. I would love to. Audiences like that one, so who knows? But yeah, I think thinking about what I can do with social a bit more is probably where I'd be looking.
I've also spoken to James Cridland, editor of Pod News, about the near-term changes in podcasting we're likely to see, looking at things such as chapters and transcripts, microtransactions and subscriptions.
The first time that I heard the phrase sustainable creativity, it was a guy called Ronsley Vaz, who runs a marketing agency but also does podcasting here in Australia. And I loved the thought, because the thought around sustainable creativity is covering your costs while you are doing something creative. So at least covering your costs. You can do far more than that if you work really, really hard. But if you're, for example, paying your hosting company $20 a month, perhaps you bought some equipment as well. Can you earn that back? Can you make sure that the creativity that you are doing, which is valuable in its own right, but can you make sure that that is at least not costing you money, but is instead generating enough money to cover its costs? So I really liked the idea of sustainable creativity. There's another podcast guru called Todd Cochran that runs a podcast company, and he talks a lot about how a podcast, it might start up with paying back the hosting company that you're using, which is about $20 a month. Then perhaps you might move up to paying off, buying a nice dinner for you and your family once a month using your podcast, or perhaps paying for the car or paying for the mortgage. It isn't necessarily a quick rush to having a job and quitting that job and starting everything up as being a podcaster. That doesn't necessarily work. But I think certainly using little steps like this is really helpful.
Thanks for listening. If you found any of these clips interesting, please check out the full episodes.